Okay, so the Trump administration's zero tolerance immigration policy, I think, was ultimately the criminalization of migrant parents. I think that in itself kind of just builds on this legacy of the historical family separation practices carried out throughout US history as we know it. And I think it's a continuation of the trend to in any way criminalize immigrants and then frame them as a threat to the country. And I think we saw this with Donald Trump when he was calling Mexicans rapists and murderers on national news outlets, when we had the caravan of migrants that were seen heading towards the US border. I think the government's justification for separating families was, I think, relied mainly on the ability to be able to vilify the migrant parents. And I think that in itself is hugely reminiscent of this historical vilification that we had of Indigenous parents and the parents of the orphan train children. So the orphan trains and the Indian adoption policies, I think, were also used to like somehow assimilate Indian children into this believed hierarchy of white American culture, and the threat of things like prison, repercussions from law enforcement for not handing over their children, I think personally is no different from the threats to immigrants crossing the Mexican or US border who were affected by the border policy enacted by Trump. So in Trump's policy, immigration officials were basically allowed to classify migrant children that they separated from parents. They were allowed to classify them as unaccompanied alien children. So once they separated them, therefore creating this narrative that echoes that of the children who were not actually orphans on the orphan trains. Saying that unaccompanied alien children implies they don't have parents or didn't have parents when they crossed the border. And unfortunately, that's not the case. But in this narrative, they're erasing not only the agency, but the existence of those migrant parents to begin with. Historically, there's always been some sort of threat that if you choose to exist and seek any form of support or help, we can take your children. And Trump's policy clearly tried to enact that same fear by using that threat of immigrants, that if you dare to cross the border with your children, we will take your children. And that even occurred in instances where people were seeking asylum, which is legal. It's not a crime. I think by labeling these immigrants as criminals, we're, as a government, basically covering their asses against legal action. Forgive my language. The US government obviously say they broke the law, therefore they did, and this allowed them to separate their children from them under the guise of criminality. I think there have been numerous efforts to reunify families that were separated at the border. However, as far as I'm aware to this day, because there were no track and trace scenarios in place, these children, or some of these children, are not going to be able to be reunified with families. And I think that's really incredibly sad. Whilst many people said this is un-American or it's not the kind of behavior that we expect from Americans, but in reality, I think historically it's exactly in line with the American values, specifically regarding immigrants. I think if we look back over US immigration history, it's very clear that Americans have long restricted the admission of those that they viewed as kind of racially, culturally, or in any way unworthy of living among us. Whereas if you were Christian, wealthy, educated as an immigrant, you were viewed as more deserving of admission, citizenship, and then poor immigrants of color were viewed as an economic or somehow a cultural threat. So I think historically America's also like carefully crafted its immigrant and refugee policies to match their perceived like national interest at the time. So an example of that would be like kind of at the end of the Civil War, I read that the Bureau of Indian Affairs enacted an important policy shift, and it's believed by many that separating Indigenous families was hugely in response to that policy being enacted. As with Indian adoption, orphan train victims, the immigrant children who were detained at the US-Mexico border also spoke of physical and sexual abuse and assault, as well as mistreatment, starvation, being forced to live in unsanitary conditions. And in the case of the orphan train movement, that kind of abuse reporting was actually the reason the policies were halted to begin with, rather than the fact that they were completely unethical from the get-go. And I think it's on the foundation of these past family separation policies that the Trump administration was able to execute the separation of thousands of migrant families.